My parents, bless their hearts, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. A milestone like that deserved something special, and they'd booked a charming bed and breakfast in the quaint coastal town of Seabrook. Little did I know, their romantic getaway was about to unravel a secret that would shake the very foundation of our family. My name is Natalie, and for the past 15 years, I've built a comfortable life as a librarian in a quiet suburb just outside of Boston. It's a life filled with the comforting scent of old books, the gentle hum of the library's climate control, and the predictable rhythm of returning patrons. My husband, Mark, is a kind and dependable man, a middle school history teacher with a dry wit and a heart of gold. We have a cozy little house with a sprawling garden that's my pride and joy, and two perfectly ordinary, if slightly demanding, tabby cats. To the outside world, and honestly to myself most of the time, my life felt complete, content even. But lately, a subtle unease had been creeping in, a feeling like a loose thread in an otherwise tightly woven tapestry. It wasn't anything I could quite put my finger on, just a general sense that something was off. My parents, Eleanor and Richard, were the epitome of a successful, long-lasting marriage. They held hands during Sunday dinners, finished each other's sentences, and still looked at each other with a fondness that made my heart feel warm. Their 40th anniversary was a big deal, and they'd been excitedly planning their trip to Seabrook for months. Seabrook was a place they'd visited early in their courtship, a nostalgic choice that made perfect sense. "We even booked the same little room at the captain's quarters," my mom had gushed over the phone, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Remember, honey? The one with the little balcony overlooking the harbor?" "Of course I remember, Mom," I'd chuckled. "Have a wonderful time. You both deserve it." The week leading up to their trip was filled with the usual flurry of activity. My mom meticulously packed, making lists and checking them twice. My dad, ever the practical one, made sure the car was in top shape and had printed out detailed maps, even though they both had smartphones with GPS. I offered to drive them to the airport, but they insisted on going themselves, wanting to start their anniversary celebration the moment they left the driveway. The day they left, I called them to wish them a safe journey. They were already on the road, their voices cheerful and upbeat. "Everything's perfect, sweetie," my mom said. "We're so excited." A few days into their trip, I received a postcard. It was a picture of the Seabrook Lighthouse, bathed in the golden light of sunset. On the back, my mom had written in her elegant cursive, "Having a wonderful time. The B&B is as charming as we remembered. Thinking of you. Love, Mom and Dad." It seemed perfectly normal, yet something about it felt distant. Almost like they were going through the motions. Then came the first little flicker of that nagging unease. I was tidying up the spare room, the one my parents sometimes stayed in when they visited. Under the bed, tucked away in a dusty corner, I found a small leather-bound journal. It was my mother's. She'd kept journals for years, filling them with her thoughts, observations, and little snippets of her day. I hadn't seen this particular one before. Curiosity piqued, I sat down on the bed and carefully opened it. The last entry was dated just a few days before their trip. It started with the usual pleasantries about the weather and her plans for the day, but then it took a strange turn. "Richard seems so happy about this trip," she wrote. "He keeps talking about all the old haunts we'll visit. I try to smile and nod, but inside I feel a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. It's been so long. Can I really do this? What if he recognizes me? What if everything we've built crumbles?" My heart pounded in my chest. Who was he? What was she so worried about? This didn't sound like a typical anniversary trip. My mom was usually so open, so carefree. This journal entry painted a picture of someone filled with apprehension and hidden turmoil. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just pre-trip jitters. Maybe he was an old acquaintance they might run into in Seabrook. But the phrase, "everything we've built crumbles," sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded much more significant than a casual encounter. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I reread the journal entry countless times, searching for clues, for any hint of what my mother was so afraid of. I thought about calling her, but I didn't want to spoil their anniversary if it was all just my overactive imagination. Then, a week into their trip, I received another call from my mom. Her voice sounded strained, not the usual cheerful tone I was accustomed to. "Natalie, honey, how are you?" "I'm fine, Mom. How's Seabrook? Are you having a good time?" I tried to sound casual. There was a slight pause. "Yes, it's lovely, but something unexpected has come up. Your father, he's not feeling well." "Oh no. What's wrong?" My worry instantly overshadowed my earlier unease. "It's nothing serious, I don't think. Just a bit of a stomach bug, but it's knocked him out. He's resting in the room. I might need to stay here a little longer with him just to make sure he's okay to travel." "Of course, Mom. Take care of him. Do you need anything? Should I come down there?" No, sweetie, everything's fine. I just wanted to let you know. Don't worry." Her voice still sounded off, but I didn't press. A few days later, I called again to check on my dad. This time, he answered the phone. His voice was weak and raspy. "Hey, Nat," he said. "Just a little something I picked up. Eleanor's been taking good care of me." "Glad to hear you're on the mend, Dad. Don't rush back. Just focus on getting better." Their story seemed plausible, but the timing felt strange. And my mother's initial journal entry kept replaying in my mind. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and I couldn't quite see the whole picture. Then came the email. It was from a local historical society in Seabrook. I'd signed up for their newsletter ages ago, having a general interest in local history. The subject line read, "Upcoming event, Seabrook High Class of '83 Reunion." My breath caught in my throat. 1983. That was the year my parents graduated high school. They'd met in their senior year and had been inseparable ever since, or so I thought. I clicked on the email, my hands trembling slightly. The email detailed the reunion, scheduled to take place at the Seabrook Community Hall on the very weekend my parents were supposed to be in town. It listed some of the notable alumni expected to attend. And then I saw the name. Daniel Hayes. Daniel Hayes. The name echoed in my mind. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. I racked my brain trying to remember if my parents had ever mentioned him. Nothing. Driven by a growing sense of unease, I decided to do a quick online search. I typed Eleanor Miller Seabrook High 1983 into the search bar. Several results popped up, including a yearbook photo. It was definitely my mom, looking much younger but with the same warm smile. I clicked on another link, a forum for Seabrook High alumni. There was a thread discussing the upcoming reunion. And then I saw it, a comment from someone named Danny H83. "Looking forward to seeing everyone. It's been too long. Especially excited to catch up with Eleanor." My blood ran cold. Eleanor. Not Eleanor and Richard, just Eleanor. I clicked on Danny H83's profile. There wasn't much information, but there was a profile picture. My breath hitched. I knew that face. I'd seen it in old family photos, tucked away in albums in the attic. It was Daniel Hayes, my mother's high school sweetheart. The one she'd been madly in love with before she met my father. The one she'd always said she'd never quite forgotten. A wave of nausea washed over me. My parents' anniversary trip wasn't just a nostalgic getaway. It was a planned reunion. And my dad's sudden illness? That was likely just a convenient excuse for my mom to spend time with Daniel. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. My mother's anxiety in her journal, her strained voice on the phone, my dad's weak and raspy tone, it all pointed to a carefully constructed deception. I felt a surge of anger, mixed with a deep sense of betrayal. How could they do this? After 40 years of marriage, how could my mother even think about rekindling a relationship with an old flame? And what about my dad? Was he in on this, or was he just another pawn in my mother's elaborate game? I couldn't sit idly by and let this unfold. I needed to know the truth. I needed to confront them. The next morning, I booked a flight to the nearest airport to Seabrook. I told Mark I had a work conference to attend, not wanting to involve him in this messy family drama just yet. He kissed me goodbye, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. The flight felt like it took forever. My mind raced with questions and anxieties. What would I say? How would they react? What if I was wrong? What if there was a perfectly innocent explanation for all of this? But deep down, I knew I wasn't wrong. My mother's journal entry, the high school reunion, Daniel Hayes's comment, the evidence was mounting. When I finally arrived in Seabrook, I rented a car and drove straight to the captain's quarters. It was a charming, albeit slightly run-down, bed and breakfast with peeling paint and overgrown rose bushes. I parked across the street, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched the entrance for what felt like hours. Finally, I saw them. My parents. They were walking hand in hand, just like always. But there was something different about their demeanor. They looked lighter, happier than I'd seen them in years. They walked down the street, away from the B&B. I waited a few minutes, then crossed the street and went inside. "Excuse me," I said to the elderly woman behind the reception desk. "I believe my parents, Eleanor and Richard Miller, are staying here." "Yes, they are," she replied with a warm smile. "Lovely couple. They're out enjoying the town right now." "Actually," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "I was wondering if I could possibly see their room." The woman looked at me with a hint of suspicion. "I'm sorry, dear, but I can't just let anyone into a guest's room." "Please," I pleaded. "It's really important. I think there might be a surprise I need to set up for their anniversary." I fumbled in my purse and pulled out a $20 bill, sliding it across the counter. The woman hesitated for a moment, then her eyes flickered down to the money. "Well," she said slowly, "they are in room number 7 on the 2nd floor. But please be quick. They shouldn't be gone for too long." I thanked her profusely and hurried up the creaky wooden stairs, room number 7. I found the door and took a deep breath before inserting the key I'd somehow managed to get from my mother's spare key ring before leaving home. The room was small and cozy, with floral wallpaper and a 4-poster bed. It looked exactly like the picture my mom had described. But it was what I saw on the bedside table that made my blood run cold. There was a framed photograph. It wasn't a picture of my parents. It was a picture of my mother and Daniel Hayes. They were younger, their arms wrapped around each other, their smiles radiant. It looked like it was taken at a high school prom. Next to the photograph was a small folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, in my mother's familiar script. "My dearest Danny," it read. 40 years. 40 years I've spent living a life that wasn't truly mine. Meeting you again has reminded me of what I've been missing. This weekend has been magical. I know we can't turn back time, but being with you feels like coming home. I love you. Always have. Always will. Eleanor. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring the words on the page. This wasn't just a casual reunion. This was a rekindling of a deep, long-lost love. My mother had been living a lie for 40 years, and my father, what did he know? Just then, I heard footsteps approaching the room. My heart leaped into my throat. They were back. I quickly folded the note and placed it back on the bedside table next to the photograph. I had to get out of here. I slipped out of the room and hurried back down the stairs, my mind reeling. I thanked the receptionist again, my voice barely a whisper, and rushed out of the bed and breakfast. Back in my rental car, I drove aimlessly for a while, the weight of my discovery crushing me. My parents' perfect marriage was a sham. My mother was in love with another man. And my father, I couldn't even begin to imagine how he would react to this. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I had come to Seabrook seeking the truth, and I had found it. But the truth was far more devastating than I could have ever imagined. What was I going to do now? Did I confront them? Did I tell my father? Or did I pretend I knew nothing and let them continue living their lie? As I sat there, staring out at the crashing waves of the nearby ocean. I knew one thing for sure. My family would never be the same. The loose thread I had sensed earlier had finally been pulled, and the tapestry of my life was beginning to unravel. The calm, predictable world I thought I knew was about to be shattered, and I had a feeling the worst was yet to come. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, driving around Seabrook without any real destination in mind. The postcard image of the lighthouse, once a symbol of a happy anniversary, now felt like a cruel mockery. Every happy couple I saw strolling along the boardwalk or sharing a meal at a seaside cafe twisted the knife of betrayal a little deeper. As the evening approached, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. I had to confront them. I drove back to the captain's quarters and parked across the street again. The lights were on in room number 7. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and walked towards the entrance. The elderly receptionist was still on duty. She looked up as I approached, a slight frown creasing her brow. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked. "Yes, thank you," I managed, my voice sounding surprisingly calm. I need to talk to my parents." I walked back up the creaky stairs and stood outside room number 7. I could hear muffled voices inside. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock. The door opened before I could. It was my mother. Her face was flushed and her eyes widened in surprise when she saw me. "Natalie? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight. "I could ask you the same question, Mom," I replied, my gaze steady. My father appeared behind her, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Natalie, what's going on? Your mother said you had a work conference." "I lied," I said simply, "just like you both have been lying to me." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face paled. He looked from me to my mother, a dawning realization in his eyes. "What are you talking about, honey?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. Instead, I held up the photograph I'd found on the bedside table. My mother gasped, and my father's jaw dropped. "This," I said, my voice low and even, "is what I'm talking about. And this." I pulled out the folded note from my pocket and held it out. My mother reached for the note, but I pulled it back. "I think Dad should see this first." My father took the note, his hands shaking so violently that the paper rattled. He unfolded it and read silently, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, the color drained completely from his face. He looked like he'd been physically struck. When he finished, he looked up at my mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and disbelief that I'd never seen before. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is this?" My mother's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out to him. "Richard, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" he said, his voice rising. "Explain how you've been carrying on an affair with your high school sweetheart for who knows how long. Explain how our entire marriage has been a lie." "It's not like that," she sobbed. "It just happened. We reconnected online a few months ago and the feelings were still there." "The feelings were still there?" my father repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. 40 years, Eleanor. 40 years we've been together. We built a life, a family, and all this time." He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his hurt. I watched the scene unfold, a strange mix of anger and sadness swirling within me. Part of me felt vindicated, knowing my suspicions were correct. But another part of me felt a profound sense of loss. The image of my parents' perfect marriage, the foundation of my own life, was crumbling before my eyes. "And what about me?" I finally interjected, my voice trembling slightly. "Did you ever think about how this would affect me? All those years you told me about your wonderful life together, the love you shared, was it all just a performance?" My mother turned to me, her face streaked with tears. "Oh, Natalie, honey, I never meant to hurt you. I love you so much." "Love me?" I scoffed. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have lied to me my entire life. You wouldn't have betrayed Dad like this." The tension in the small room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My father sank down onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. My mother stood there, sobbing uncontrollably. "I came here for your anniversary," I said, my voice softer now, the anger giving way to a weary sadness. I wanted to celebrate 40 years of love and commitment. Instead, I found this. I gestured to the photograph and the note. "Richard," my mother pleaded, kneeling down beside him. "Please say something. Don't just sit there." He finally looked up, his eyes red and filled with pain. "I don't know what to say, Eleanor. I never saw this coming." "He's sick," my mother said, turning to me. "That's why we're still here. He hasn't been feeling well." "Oh, I'm sure he hasn't," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Finding out your wife is in love with another man can't be good for the stomach." My father flinched as if I'd slapped him. My mother glared at me, a spark of anger flickering in her tear-filled eyes. "Natalie, that's enough." "No, Mom, it's not enough," I retorted. "I deserve to know the truth. How long has this been going on?" My mother hesitated, her eyes darting between me and my father. It's only been a few months." "A few months?" my father repeated, his voice incredulous. "And you've already written love letters and planned secret reunions?" "Daniel Hayes." The name echoed in the silence of the room. I pictured the man from the yearbook photo, the one my mother had loved so deeply. What was so special about him that she would risk everything for a chance to be with him again? "I saw the email," I said, breaking the tense silence. "The one about the high school reunion. Is that where you met him?" My mother nodded, her head bowed in shame. "Yes. It was just supposed to be a friendly catch-up." "And then one thing led to another?" I finished for her, my voice heavy with disappointment. "It just felt like we had a second chance," she whispered. "Like maybe we were meant to be together all along." "And what about your vows, Mom?" I asked, my voice rising again. "What about, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health? Did those mean nothing to you?" She didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. My father finally stood up, his face etched with a newfound resolve. "I think I need some air," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. He walked towards the door. "Richard, where are you going?" my mother called after him. "I don't know, Eleanor," he replied, his hand on the doorknob, "but I can't stay here right now." He opened the door and walked out, leaving my mother and me alone in the tense silence of the room. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Natalie, please try to understand. It's complicated." "No, Mom, it's not," I said, my voice firm. "You made a choice. You chose to betray Dad, and you chose to lie to me, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, alone and sobbing. I went downstairs and told the receptionist I was checking out. I couldn't stay in that place any longer. I spent the night at a small motel on the outskirts of town, my mind racing. I thought about my father, wandering alone, his heart broken. I thought about my mother, trapped in a web of her own making. And I thought about myself, my perception of my family shattered beyond repair. The next morning, I drove back to Seabrook, hoping to find my father. I checked the local coffee shops and diners, the places he would usually gravitate towards. Finally, I found him sitting on a bench overlooking the harbor, the same view from the postcard. He looked lost and defeated. I sat down beside him, not saying a word. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. Finally, he sighed and turned to me. "I guess you know everything," he said, his voice weary. I nodded. "I do, Dad, I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "It's not your fault, Nat. I never thought she would do something like this. We've been together for so long, I thought we were happy." "Maybe she wasn't," I said softly. He looked out at the horizon, a faraway look in his eyes. "Maybe not. Maybe I was just too blind to see it." "What are you going to do?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't know. I need some time to think. I can't even look at her right now." "Do you want me to stay with you?" He shook his head. "No, honey. You go home. I'll be all right. I just need some time alone." I hugged him tightly, my heart aching for him. Then, I drove back to the airport, leaving him there by the harbor, a solitary figure against the vast expanse of the ocean. The flight home was quiet and introspective. I replayed the events of the past few days in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. My parents, the pillars of my life, had suddenly become flawed and human, capable of deception and heartbreak. When I got home, Mark was waiting for me, his face etched with concern. "How was the conference?" he asked. I looked at him, at his kind and honest face, and the contrast between him and my parents' deceit was stark. I knew I couldn't keep this from him. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling, "we need to talk." I told him everything: the journal entry, the high school reunion, Daniel Hayes, the photograph, the note, the confrontation. He listened patiently, his expression shifting from shock to sympathy. When I finished, he pulled me into a hug. "Oh, Nat," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." That's a lot to take in." "I don't know what to do," I confessed, tears welling up in my eyes. "My whole life feels like a lie." "It's not your lie, Nat," he said, holding me tighter. "It's theirs, and you'll get through this. We'll get through this together." Over the next few weeks, the fallout from my discovery continued. My father eventually came home, but the atmosphere in their house was heavy and strained. They barely spoke to each other. I tried to talk to my mother, but she was defensive and full of excuses. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she'd say, her voice laced with self-pity. "Danny and I we have a connection that I've never felt with anyone else." I didn't want to hear it. I couldn't understand how she could so easily dismiss 40 years of marriage, the life they had built together, the family they had created. My father, on the other hand, was quiet and withdrawn. He started spending more time in his study, surrounded by his books, seeking solace in their familiar pages. Eventually, they started talking about separation, then divorce. The thought of my parents, who had always been my rock, splitting up was devastating. But deep down, I knew it was probably for the best. Their marriage had been built on a lie, and it was time for them both to find their own truths, however painful that might be. As for me, I started to see my own life in a new light. The subtle unease I had felt earlier now made sense. Perhaps I had subconsciously sensed the cracks in my parents' seemingly perfect facade. I leaned on Mark for support, and he was my rock through it all. We talked for hours, and he helped me process my anger, my sadness, and my confusion. Life as I knew it had changed irrevocably. The comfortable predictability was gone, replaced by uncertainty and a sense of loss. But amidst the turmoil, there was also a glimmer of something else, a sense of liberation. The perfect image of my family had been shattered, but perhaps that was okay. Perhaps it was time for me to focus on building my own authentic life, one that wasn't based on illusions. A few months later, my parents officially separated. My father moved into a small apartment near the library, and my mother stayed in the family home. They were both navigating their new realities, trying to find their footing in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath them. I visited my father often. We would sit in comfortable silence, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying each other's company. He seemed to be slowly finding peace, rediscovering old hobbies, and reconnecting with friends. My relationship with my mother remained strained. I couldn't bring myself to fully forgive her, not yet. But I tried to be civil, knowing that despite everything, she was still my mother.